What if I told you that one teacher's cruel words would trigger the most elaborate revenge plot in educational history? A revenge so perfect, so devastating, that it would destroy not just one person's career, but expose an entire system of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The fluorescent lights in Jefferson High School's room 204 flickered like dying stars. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. The air conditioning hadn't worked properly in 3 years, and the stale smell of teenage anxiety mixed with chalk dust created an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson stood at the front of her advanced mathematics classroom like a general surveying a battlefield. At 53 years old, she had the kind of presence that could silence a room with a single glance. Her grey hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. Her clothes were always pristine, always expensive, always perfectly coordinated in a way that reminded everyone she considered herself superior to her surroundings. Behind her, the whiteboard was covered in complex algebraic equations that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics to most of her students. The problems weren't just difficult, they were designed to be impossible for anyone who didn't already understand the concepts perfectly. Mrs. Henderson called it maintaining academic standards. Her students had other words for it. 28 teenagers sat in perfectly arranged rows, each desk exactly 18 inches from the next. Mrs. Henderson had measured them herself with a ruler on the first day of school, explaining that precision in environment creates precision in thought. What she'd really created was an atmosphere of rigid fear where creativity went to die and confidence withered like flowers in winter. The wall clock ticked with mechanical precision, each second stretching into eternity for the students trapped in this academic prison. Outside the windows, other kids were heading to buses, to after-school activities, to freedom. But not the students in advanced math. They were trapped until Mrs. Henderson decided their suffering was complete. "Turn in your monthly examinations," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 23 years perfecting the art of intimidation. "Place them in the basket at the front of the room. Neat stacks. No talking. No exceptions." The ritual began. One by one, students filed forward with their test papers. Some walked confidently, the lucky few who'd been born with mathematical minds and supportive families. Others shuffled forward like prisoners walking to execution, their papers clutched in sweaty palms, knowing that what they were about to submit would determine not just their grades, but their sense of self-worth for weeks to come. Jessica Park, the class valedictorian, glided forward with her test paper pristine and perfectly organized. She'd finished early, of course, and had spent the extra time double-checking her work with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced academic failure. Behind her came Michael Rodriguez, star of the debate team, his test covered in neat handwriting and methodical calculations. He'd struggled with some of the problems, but his privileged background had provided him with tutors and resources that made success achievable. Then came the middle-tier students who'd worked hard, studied diligently, and might scrape by with BS or CS if they were lucky. Their faces showed the strain of the past hour, the mental exhaustion of wrestling with concepts that felt deliberately obscure. And then there were the others. The students Mrs. Henderson had already written off. The ones she viewed not as individuals with unique learning styles and untapped potential, but as statistics that dragged down her class averages and reflected poorly on her teaching record. Sarah Kim sat 3 rows back, her test paper crumpled from nervous fidgeting. She was brilliant with languages, could speak 4 fluently, and had dreams of becoming a diplomat. But numbers seemed to dance mockingly in her mind, rearranging themselves into incomprehensible patterns whenever she tried to solve equations. She'd spent 5 hours studying the night before, working through practice problems until her eyes burned, but the test might as well have been written in code. Marcus Thompson, 2 seats behind Sarah, was still frantically scribbling answers, his left-handedness making him work twice as hard in a world designed for righties. He was a gifted artist who could sketch portraits that captured not just physical features but emotional depths that professional photographers struggled to achieve. But math had always been his nemesis, a subject that demanded linear thinking when his mind worked in colors and curves and abstract possibilities. Elena Rodriguez sat near the window, having given up entirely 20 minutes into the test. She was first in her family to attend high school, working 2 part-time jobs to help support her younger siblings while maintaining a 3.5 GPA in every subject except mathematics. The pressure of being a role model for her family combined with Mrs. Henderson's teaching style had created a mental block that made even simple calculations feel impossible. But it was Alex Martinez, sitting in the third row center, who would become the focal point of everything that followed. Alex was 16 years old, thin for his age, with dark hair that never quite cooperated no matter how much gel he used. His clothes were clean but clearly secondhand, shirts that had been worn by older cousins, jeans that were slightly too long, shoes that had been resold twice because his family couldn't afford new ones. He carried himself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned early that drawing attention was dangerous. His desk held a test paper that told a story of struggle and defeat. Out of 30 complex problems, he'd managed to complete exactly 3. Not because he hadn't tried, the eraser marks and scratched-out attempts covered nearly every inch of the paper, evidence of a mind that understood more than it could express through traditional testing methods. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Alex Martinez was perhaps the most brilliant person in that entire building. His mind worked in ways that would revolutionize how people thought about intelligence, creativity, and human potential. But traditional education, with its emphasis on standardized testing and one-size-fits-all approaches, was like trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon. Alex had severe dyslexia and ADHD, conditions that made traditional learning methods not just difficult but often counterproductive. When he looked at mathematical equations on paper, the numbers seemed to move and rearrange themselves. The symbols blurred together, creating visual chaos that no amount of concentration could resolve. But when he worked with technology, when he could manipulate numbers and concepts in digital environments that adapted to his learning style, Alex was unstoppable. He'd been coding since he was 11 years old, starting with simple HTML websites and progressing to complex applications that solved real-world problems. He'd created an inventory system for his uncle's small grocery store that increased efficiency by 40%. He'd built a tutoring app that helped other students with learning disabilities master difficult concepts through gamification and adaptive learning algorithms. None of this was reflected in his GPA, of course. Traditional schools didn't know how to measure intelligence that didn't fit their predetermined molds. And teachers like Mrs. Henderson saw only test scores, only surface-level performance indicators that told them nothing about the complex, brilliant minds sitting in their classrooms. As the last students filed forward to submit their tests, Alex remained seated. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the frustration of knowing he understood the mathematical concepts better than most of his classmates but couldn't express that understanding in the format Mrs. Henderson demanded. The classroom fell silent except for the persistent hum of the failing air conditioning and the distant sounds of freedom echoing from the hallways. Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes scanned the room like a predator searching for weakness, and they settled on Alex with the precision of a laser targeting system. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "I don't see your paper in the collection basket." Every head in the room turned toward Alex. 27 pairs of eyes focusing on him with a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and relief that they weren't the ones in the spotlight. The attention made his skin crawl, made him want to disappear through the floor or melt into his chair. I'm still working on it, Mrs. Henderson," Alex replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson's perfectly painted lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else's face. On hers, it looked like a shark baring its teeth. "Still working on it," she repeated, her voice dripping with mock concern. "The test period ended 5 minutes ago, Mr. Martinez. Surely you don't need additional time to demonstrate your limited capabilities." The word limited hung in the air like poison gas. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the first time they'd witnessed Mrs. Henderson's cruelty, and they knew it wouldn't be the last. Alex's face flushed red. His hands clenched into fists under his desk. "I just need a few more minutes to what?" Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "To continue pretending you understand concepts that are clearly beyond your intellectual capacity." She began walking toward him, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor with the rhythm of a countdown timer. Each step echoed in the silent classroom like a death march, building tension until the very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. "Class, Mrs. Henderson announced without taking her eyes off Alex, I want you to observe something important. Mr. Martinez here represents a perfect example of what happens when students are placed in academic environments that exceed their natural limitations." Alex's chest tightened. His vision began to blur at the edges. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation that had haunted his nightmares since elementary school. Mrs. Henderson reached his desk and, without warning, snatched the test paper from his hands. She held it up toward the fluorescent lights, examining it like a detective studying evidence at a crime scene. "Fascinating," she said, her voice loud enough for every student to hear clearly. "Out of 30 problems, Mr. Martinez has attempted, let me see, 3 complete answers. 3. She turned the paper toward the class, displaying Alex's work like a trophy. The scratched-out attempts, the eraser marks, the evidence of his struggles were now visible to everyone. And of these 3 attempts, Mrs. Henderson continued, exactly 0 are correct." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to watch the destruction of another human being. Others looked on with a mixture of horror and fascination, like witnesses to a traffic accident. Alex wanted to explain. Wanted to tell her about his learning disabilities, about the accommodations he was supposed to receive but rarely got, about the fact that he could solve these same problems flawlessly when he had access to assistive technology. But the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. "You know what this represents, class?" Mrs. Henderson asked rhetorically, still holding Alex's paper aloft. "This represents the danger of social promotion. The misguided belief that every student, regardless of ability, deserves to be in advanced academic programs." She walked back toward the front of the room, Alex's test paper still in her hand like evidence in a criminal trial. "Some students," she continued, "are naturally gifted. They possess the intellectual capacity to tackle challenging concepts, to think abstractly, to solve complex problems. These students deserve our best resources, our highest expectations, our greatest attention." Jessica Park straightened in her seat, basking in the implied praise. Michael Rodriguez nodded slightly, feeling validated in his academic achievements. "But other students," Mrs. Henderson said, turning to look directly at Alex, "are simply not equipped for academic excellence. They lack the cognitive ability, the intellectual curiosity, the mental discipline required for advanced learning." Each word hit Alex like a physical blow. His hands were shaking now, not from nervousness but from pure rage that he couldn't express without making everything worse. Henderson continued, "Would be better served in vocational programs, technical schools, career paths that don't require advanced analytical thinking." She paused at her desk, Alex's test paper still in her hand, and smiled that predatory smile again. "Mr. Martinez here is a perfect example. Despite being given the same instruction, the same resources, the same opportunities as his peers, he consistently demonstrates that advanced mathematics is simply beyond his capabilities." The room was so quiet that the distant sound of buses pulling away from the school seemed as loud as thunder. Alex could feel his classmates' eyes on him, could sense their mixture of pity and relief that they weren't the ones being dissected in front of everyone. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. She was just getting started. "I've been teaching for 23 years, she announced, walking slowly back toward Alex's desk. "And in all that time, in all the thousands of students I've encountered, I have never seen such a consistent pattern of academic failure." She stopped directly beside Alex's desk, so close he could smell her overpowering perfume and see the satisfaction in her eyes. "Mr. Martinez, I want you to understand something very clearly. This isn't about effort. I've watched you struggle, seen you stay after class, observed your futile attempts to grasp concepts that your classmates master effortlessly." Alex stared at his desk, unable to meet her gaze, unable to defend himself without risking even greater humiliation. "This is about natural ability," Mrs. Henderson continued. "About accepting reality. About understanding that not everyone is meant for academic success." She leaned down until her face was just inches from his, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a caring whisper but was actually loud enough for the entire class to hear. "You are not college material, Alex. You never will be. The sooner you accept this reality, the sooner you can find a path in life that actually suits your limitations." The word limitations was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut as deeply as possible while maintaining the facade of educational guidance. Alex's vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. His hands clenched and unclenched under his desk. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand up, to defend himself, to explain that she was wrong about everything. But he remained silent. Because he'd learned that fighting back only made things worse. That defending yourself against a teacher's cruelty was seen as disrespect, insubordination, proof that you deserved whatever punishment followed. Mrs. Henderson straightened up, apparently satisfied with the destruction she'd accomplished. But she wasn't done yet. She was about to deliver the killing blow that would haunt Alex for months and ultimately trigger everything that followed. "Class," she announced, returning to the front of the room, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember what it looks like when someone refuses to accept their intellectual limitations." She held up Alex's test paper one more time, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Mr. Martinez represents everything that's wrong with modern education. The participation trophy mentality. The belief that effort matters more than ability. The dangerous fiction that every student can succeed at everything." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, as if she were delivering a sermon on educational truth. "But reality doesn't care about our feelings. Reality doesn't adjust to accommodate our limitations. And the reality is that some students are destined for greatness while others—" She looked directly at Alex, her eyes cold and merciless. "Others are destined for mediocrity at best. Complete failure at worst." The silence that followed was devastating. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist. Alex felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, that was stronger than Mrs. Henderson could imagine. But his willingness to remain passive, to accept abuse, to let others define his worth. Something fundamental shifted in that moment. A quiet rage began to build in the depths of his soul, not the hot anger of a teenager having a tantrum, but the cold fury of someone who'd finally seen the true face of their enemy. Mrs. Henderson walked back to her desk, apparently satisfied with her work. She placed Alex's test paper in what she called her failure file, a collection of the worst student work that she kept as evidence of why some children simply couldn't be helped. "Mr. Martinez," she said without looking up from her gradebook, "please remain after class. We need to discuss your future in this program. Or lack thereof." The dismissal bell rang, and 27 students began gathering their belongings with the careful quiet of people who'd witnessed something they wished they could forget. No one looked at Alex as they filed out. Some couldn't bear to see his humiliation. Others were simply grateful it hadn't been them. Sarah Kim hesitated at the door, wanting to say something supportive, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say that wouldn't make things worse? Marcus Thompson walked past Alex's desk and briefly placed his hand on Alex's shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more than he knew. But one by one, they all left. Until Alex sat alone in room 204 with Mrs. Henderson, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects, the smell of teenage anxiety now replaced by the sterile scent of institutional authority. Mrs. Henderson finished entering grades into her computer before acknowledging Alex's presence. The delay was intentional, a power play designed to make him squirm while contemplating his academic mortality. Finally, she looked up from her screen and fixed him with that cold stare that had intimidated students for more than 2 decades. "Alex," she began, her voice now carrying the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "we need to have an honest conversation about your academic future." She pulled out a thick folder labeled Martinez, Alexander, and opened it on her desk. The contents were visible from where Alex sat: test papers marked with red ink, progress reports filled with failing grades, documentation of every academic stumble he'd made in her class. "I've been reviewing your performance over the past semester," she continued, flipping through papers like a prosecutor building a case. "The pattern is unmistakable. Consistent failure. inability to grasp basic concepts, complete lack of mathematical reasoning skills. Each word was chosen for maximum impact. Mrs. Henderson had perfected the art of destroying student confidence while maintaining the appearance of educational concern. "I've spoken with your other teachers," she said, which was a lie designed to make Alex feel even more isolated. "The consensus is clear. You're struggling in multiple subjects, not just mathematics." This was also untrue. Alex maintained B's and A's in most of his other classes, particularly those that allowed for alternative assessment methods or accommodated his learning differences. But Mrs. Henderson had learned that isolated students were easier to manipulate, easier to convince that they were the problem. "I've also reviewed your standardized test scores," she continued, pulling out official-looking documents. "The results are concerning." She turned the papers toward him, pointing at numbers and percentiles that meant nothing without proper context. What she didn't mention was that these tests were designed for neurotypical learners and had been criticized by educational experts as culturally biased and inadequate measures of true intelligence. "Alex, I need you to understand something very important," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice taking on what she probably thought was a caring tone. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for a student is to help them understand their realistic options." She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, studying him like a scientist examining a failed experiment. "You're 16 years old. Old enough to start making practical decisions about your future. And based on everything I've observed, your future lies in vocational training, not academic pursuits." Alex finally found his voice. "Mrs. Henderson, I know I struggle with tests, but I understand the concepts. If I could just know, Alex." She cut him off with the authority of someone who'd silenced thousands of students over the years. "This isn't about test anxiety or learning styles or any of the other excuses that modern education has embraced. This is about intellectual capacity." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where buses were pulling away, carrying successful students to after-school activities and bright futures. "I've seen thousands of students come through these doors," she said without turning around. "I can predict with remarkable accuracy which ones will succeed and which ones will struggle throughout their lives." She turned back to face him, her expression mixing pity with certainty. "You, Alex Martinez, are going to struggle. Not because you're lazy or because you don't try hard enough, but because you simply don't possess the intellectual tools necessary for academic success." The words hit him like physical blows. Each sentence was crafted to destroy not just his confidence but his fundamental sense of self-worth. "I'm going to recommend that you be transferred out of advanced mathematics," she continued, "into a basic skills program that's more appropriate for students with your limitations." There was that word again. Limitations. She wielded it like a weapon, using it to define and confine him within boundaries she'd created. "Furthermore, I'm going to suggest that you and your parents have serious conversations about realistic career paths. Technical training, trade schools, jobs that don't require complex analytical thinking." Mrs. Henderson walked back to her desk and picked up her phone. "In fact, I think your parents need to understand the situation immediately. They've been operating under some very unrealistic assumptions about your academic potential." Alex's heart began racing. The thought of his parents receiving this call, of seeing their hopes for his future crushed by this woman's narrow assessment, was almost unbearable. "Mrs. Henderson, please don't call my parents," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're working, and this will just Alex, your parents need to know the truth. It's irresponsible of me to let them continue believing that college is a realistic option for you." She began dialing, and Alex realized he was about to witness the destruction of his family's dreams in real time. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Mrs. Martinez?" Mrs. Henderson's voice suddenly became professionally pleasant. "This is Eleanor Henderson, Alex's mathematics teacher at Jefferson High. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Alex could hear his mother's voice through the speaker, small and concerned, speaking in the careful English she used when talking to authority figures. "I'm calling because Alex and I have been having some important conversations about his academic future," Mrs. Henderson continued. I think it's time for all of us to have an honest discussion about realistic expectations. She paused, listening to Alex's mother's response, and Alex could imagine his mom's growing anxiety as she tried to understand why her son's teacher was calling with such ominous language. Mrs. Martinez, I've been teaching for 23 years, and I've developed a fairly reliable ability to assess student potential, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice taking on the tone of an expert delivering professional judgment. Alex is a sweet boy, and I can see that he tries very hard. But trying hard isn't always enough. Some students are naturally gifted for academic work, while others have different strengths that lie in other areas. The conversation continued, and Alex watched his future being dismantled one professionally delivered sentence at a time. Mrs. Henderson spoke with the authority of educational expertise, using phrases like intellectual capacity and realistic assessment and alternative pathways to make her cruelty sound like caring guidance. I'm recommending that Alex be moved to our basic mathematics program, she said. Something more appropriate for students who struggle with abstract reasoning and complex problem solving. Alex could hear his mother asking questions, her voice getting higher with stress and confusion. She was trying to understand how her intelligent, creative son could suddenly be described as intellectually limited by someone who was supposed to be helping him learn. College might not be the best option for Alex, Mrs. Henderson continued, delivering the killing blow with clinical precision. There are many excellent trade programs that would be much more suitable for someone with his academic profile. The call went on for another 10 minutes, with Mrs. Henderson systematically destroying every hope and dream Alex's family had built around his education. She spoke about accepting reality and focusing on practical skills and not setting unrealistic expectations. When she finally hung up, the silence in room 204 was deafening. Alex sat in his chair feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. The woman who was supposed to be his teacher, his guide, his advocate in the educational system, had just convinced his family that he was intellectually deficient. Alex, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice returning to its normal coldness, I know this is difficult to hear. But sometimes the truth is painful. She gathered the papers from his file and straightened them into a neat stack. You have value as a person, she continued, and Alex could hear the but coming before she said it. But that value doesn't lie in academic achievement. You need to find other ways to contribute to society. She looked at him with what she probably thought was compassionate understanding but was actually condescending pity. There's nothing wrong with being average, Alex. The world needs people who can do practical work, manual labor, simple tasks that keep society functioning. Each word was another nail in the coffin of his academic dreams. But what the world doesn't need, she said, her voice hardening again, is people who refuse to accept their limitations and waste everyone's time pretending to be something they're not. Mrs. Henderson walked to the classroom door and opened it, a clear signal that their conversation was over. You can go now, Alex. And remember what we discussed today. The sooner you accept reality, the happier you'll be. Alex gathered his backpack and walked toward the door on unsteady legs. As he passed Mrs. Henderson, she placed her hand on his shoulder in what she probably thought was a gesture of support. Don't take this personally, she said. This isn't about you as a person. It's about being realistic about academic ability. Alex looked up at her face and saw something that chilled him to the bone. She wasn't being cruel on purpose. She genuinely believed everything she'd said. In her mind, she was being kind, helping him avoid future disappointment by crushing his dreams now. That realization was somehow worse than if she'd been deliberately malicious. Alex walked out of room 204 and into the building felt hollow, echoing with the ghosts of thousands of dreams that had been crushed within its walls. He made it to the parking lot before the tears started. Not tears of sadness, though there was plenty of that. Tears of pure rage. Frustration. The overwhelming fury that comes from being completely powerless in the face of systematic injustice. Alex sat on the concrete steps of the school entrance and let everything wash over him. The humiliation of being torn apart in front of his classmates. The horror of listening to his dreams being systematically destroyed in a phone call to his parents. The crushing weight of having someone in authority tell him he was intellectually worthless. But as he sat there, something began to shift inside him. The tears stopped. The overwhelming emotion began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. For the first time in his life, Alex Martinez began to truly understand the difference between justice and revenge. Justice would be getting Mrs. Henderson to acknowledge her mistakes, to change her teaching methods, to treat students with more compassion and understanding. But Alex was beginning to realize that some people were incapable of justice. Some people had convinced themselves so completely of their own righteousness that they could destroy lives while believing they were being helpful. Mrs. Henderson wasn't going to change. He opened a notes app and began typing. Step 1, research. He paused, looking back at the building that housed room 204, and felt a cold smile cross his face. Mrs. Henderson thought she knew everything about her students. She believed she could predict their futures, assess their worth, determine their value based on standardized tests and traditional measurements. But she knew nothing about Alex Martinez. She didn't know about his coding abilities, his technological genius, his capacity for complex problem-solving when given the right tools and environment. She didn't know about his perfect memory for details, his ability to see patterns that others missed, his talent for strategic thinking that went far beyond anything measured by her meaningless tests. Most importantly, she didn't know that she just declared war on someone who was perfectly capable of fighting back. Alex looked at his phone again and continued typing. Step 2, intelligence gathering. Step 3, weakness identification. Step 4, strategic planning. Step 5, execution. He stood up from the concrete steps, shouldered his backpack, and began the long walk home. But his mind wasn't on the walk. It was already 3 steps ahead, beginning to formulate a plan that would make Mrs. Henderson understand exactly how wrong she'd been about everything. By the time Alex reached his house, he'd made a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of every student who would ever sit in room 204. Mrs. Henderson had spent 23 years believing she had the power to determine who succeeded and who failed. It was time someone taught her what real power looked like. Alex walked through his front door and headed straight to his bedroom, where his computer was waiting. As he powered up his system and opened his development environment, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. He was about to embark on the most important project of his life. And Mrs. Henderson was going to be his first and most devastating case study. The war had begun. Alex's bedroom was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where he felt completely in control. 3 monitors glowed on his desk, displaying code, system diagnostics, and network analyses that would have impressed professional cybersecurity experts. His setup looked like mission control for a space launch, all carefully assembled with money earned from freelance programming jobs that his teachers knew nothing about. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same kid Mrs. Henderson had called intellectually limited was earning more money from his coding skills than most adults in their town made at their regular jobs. Alex sat down at his keyboard and cracked his knuckles. For the first time in hours, he felt at home. Let's see what we're dealing with, he murmured to himself as he began typing. His first step was reconnaissance. Every good strategist understood that knowledge was power, and Alex intended to know everything about his enemy before making a single move. He started with basic searches. Mrs. Henderson's full name was Eleanor Margaret Henderson, age 53, 23 years of teaching experience at Jefferson High School. She lived at 1247 Elm Street in the affluent Oakwood neighborhood, drove a late-model BMW, and owned a vacation home in the mountains that seemed expensive for someone on a teacher's salary. But Alex was just getting started. He moved into deeper waters, using techniques he'd learned from online cybersecurity courses and hacking forums. Mrs. Henderson's digital footprint was surprisingly extensive for someone her age, and surprisingly unprotected. Her Facebook profile revealed a lifestyle that didn't match her public persona as a dedicated educator. Expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, designer clothes, jewelry that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The photos showed someone who clearly enjoyed the finer things in life, all while complaining publicly about teacher salaries and budget cuts. But it was her privacy settings, or lack thereof, that really caught Alex's attention. Mrs. Henderson had made the classic mistake of older internet users. She'd set her profile to public, apparently not understanding that everything she posted was visible to anyone who looked. Her friends list was accessible, her photos were unprotected, and her personal information was scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs leading back to secrets she didn't even know she'd revealed. Alex spent 3 hours that first night mapping out her digital presence. Email addresses, social media accounts, online shopping profiles, subscription services, even her Netflix account with its embarrassingly predictable password, Henderson 1970. By midnight, he had assembled a comprehensive profile that would have made professional investigators proud. But this was just the foundation. The real work was about to begin. Over the next week, Alex maintained his normal routine. He went to classes, endured Mrs. Henderson's continued cruelty, and pretended to be the broken, defeated student she believed him to be. But every evening, he disappeared into his room and continued building his case. The deeper he dug, the more interesting things became. Mrs. Henderson's financial records, which should have been private but weren't due to her poor digital security habits, told a fascinating story. Her salary as a high school teacher was a matter of public record, $52,000 per year. But her spending patterns suggested an income at least 3 times that amount. Where was the extra money coming from? Alex's investigation revealed multiple income streams that raised serious questions about professional ethics and possible legal violations. Mrs. Henderson had been running a private tutoring business out of her home, charging wealthy families premium rates to help their children succeed in her own classes. This created an obvious conflict of interest. She could make struggling students perform better in her public classroom while profiting from private sessions with students who could afford her services. But that was just the beginning. Alex discovered that Mrs. Henderson had been accepting donations from parents in exchange for improved grades and letters of recommendation. The payments were carefully disguised as gifts for classroom supplies or contributions to educational programs, but the timing was suspiciously aligned with grade changes and college application seasons. Even more damaging was her involvement in a standardized testing scandal. Mrs. Henderson had been providing advance copies of state assessments to students whose parents made substantial contributions to her educational fund. This gave those students significant advantages while making others appear less capable by comparison. The most shocking discovery came when Alex accessed her email accounts and found correspondence with college admissions officers. Mrs. Henderson had been actively sabotaging certain students' college prospects by sending negative assessments that contradicted their official transcripts and recommendations from other teachers. Students she deemed unworthy of higher education, primarily those from lower-income families or with learning differences, were being systematically excluded from opportunities through her behind-the-scenes manipulation. Alex sat back in his chair, staring at the evidence he'd accumulated. Mrs. Henderson wasn't just a cruel teacher. She was running a sophisticated scheme that turned education into a commodity available only to those who could afford to pay for it. But Alex still needed more. He needed something that would be undeniably damaging, impossible to explain away, and shocking enough to guarantee serious consequences. That's when he found the financial records. Mrs. Henderson had been embezzling money from school accounts for years. Field trip funds, fundraising proceeds, budget allocations for classroom supplies, all of it systematically diverted to her personal accounts through a network of fake vendors and inflated invoices. The amounts were staggering. Over her 23-year career, she'd stolen more than $800,000 from programs designed to help students. Money that should have gone to updated textbooks, technology improvements, scholarships for underprivileged kids, and resources for students with special needs. She'd been literally stealing from the children she was supposed to serve, all while lecturing them about their limitations and crushing their dreams to hide her own crimes. Alex printed out bank statements, invoice records, and transaction histories. He cross-referenced donation records with grade changes. He documented every instance of academic fraud, financial theft, and ethical violation he could find. By the end of 2 weeks, he had assembled a case that would not only end Mrs. She'd been literally stealing from the children she was supposed to serve, all while lecturing them about their limitations and crushing their dreams to hide her own crimes. Alex printed out bank statements, invoice records, and transaction histories. He cross-referenced donation records with grade changes. He documented every instance of academic fraud, financial theft, and ethical violation he could find. By the end of 2 weeks, he had assembled a case that would not only end